And before this video begins, I'd like to give a special shout out to my Asbantium level patron, Fallon Cortez. If you've noticed, over the last decade or so, we're currently living in the reboot of the 1980s. It's the 80s to Electric Boogaloo. Almost everything has to be inspired by the 80s in some way, or straight up set during the decade. So I'd probably say it's the perfect time to check out Doctor Who's own Member Berries nostalgic 80s episode, Cold War, which sees the Doctor and Clara Oswald accidentally land on a Soviet submarine during the height of the Cold War, where a long frozen ice warrior breaks free and becomes determined to get revenge against the entire human race. You know, I really hate it when that happens. Naturally, being a Mark Gatiss episode, the fanbase's perception of Cold War is pretty middling, if anyone even remembers it enough to have an opinion of it. But is there more to this story? Is it an underappreciated gem with good themes? Or is it a bit of a Kusok Derma? And more importantly, are you going to press that appetizing like button or the big red nuclear explodey button? I trust you to make the right choice. There's an ancient Latin phrase that goes, amicus meus in amicus in amici mei. This roughly translates to, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. It's a sentiment you've probably encountered countless times during your life. This idea that you can put aside your differences to battle a greater threat. A prime example of this are the Western powers and the Soviet Union in World War II. These entities were very different, with the UK and USA very much not vibing with Mr. Stalin and all his atrocities, along with the sheer power of the communist regime terrifying the extremely capitalist America. The Soviet Union had even been expelled from the League of Nations in 1939 for invading Finland, before sneakily annexing Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania while everyone was busy dealing with, you know, Mr. Hilter over there. So it's safe to say the Soviets weren't on the Western countries' Christmas card lists. The USSR was also aligned with Germany for a period, both nations invading and occupying Poland together in 1939. However, despite this, the Soviets remained out of World War II, until Germany stabbed them in the back and launched the surprise Operation Barbarossa, attempting to invade the Western Soviet Union and add it to their growing Third Reich Empire. Therefore, Stalin adopted the strategy of, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, joining the Allies and forcing Germany to fight the war on two fronts, ultimately becoming the nation to take Berlin and force Germany into submission. But with the German threat squashed, tensions between the Soviet Union and the West returned, bolstered by the USSR's many war crimes and actions during the war, leading to the long-running Cold War between the United States and Russia, something you could argue never actually ended. But that's a topic that doesn't really fit this channel. The Cold War was an incredibly tense period of time with the entire world hanging in the balance, because one side flinching would immediately cause nuclear Armageddon. There's even that famous story of Vasily Arkhipov, a Soviet Navy officer who refused to launch nukes during the Cuban Missile Crisis and possibly single-handedly prevented World War III. The entire planet was on a knife's edge for decades, and writer Mark Gatiss had grown up during these tensions, becoming, quote, kind of obsessed with the Cold War. So unsurprisingly, this episode takes place during the titular conflict. This backdrop is incredibly effective, seamlessly integrated within the story and its narrative. As we'll get to later on, the entire conflict is almost summed up in this episode, with so many core components of the war visualised through the lens of this seemingly simple alien attack, base under siege Doctor Who episode. It's very in-depth with how it explores the background tensions, and the plot itself is almost symbolic and representative of all the complicated relations and beliefs of the time, since there was so much complexity involved in the Cold War. And hell, the Doctor and Clara working with the Russians to fight Skaldak is even kind of like that enemy of my enemy is my friend philosophy. I like how the story doesn't treat the Soviets like some big, bad, evil monster. Obviously they start the story very suspicious of the Doctor and Clara, believing them to be spies or saboteurs. But throughout the narrative we learn the crew of the sub represent a varied spectrum of beliefs and opinions about the Cold War itself. There are some like Lieutenant Stefashin who are very gung-ho about the conflict and see every NATO training exercise as a threat. Stepashin is uncomfortable with the uneasy peace and believes conflict is inevitable, so he wants to strike first to get out of the way. But then there's also Captain Zhukov, who is a lot more level-headed, understanding both sides are on the edge and posturing. And lastly there's Professor Grushenko, who adores the British band Ultravox, despite all the anti-Western propaganda he would have been subjected to. Having all these very distinct personalities and outlooks helps to add a real depth to the Russians, showing how they also have a lot of the same fears and beliefs that the Western nations had. There was no single aggressor in the Cold War. It was more of a standoff, with everyone on either side constantly terrified the other would launch the nukes first. The Soviets were just as scared as the Americans and Europeans, and I think this episode does a good job showing that, making them very sympathetic and normal instead of going down the predictable Western oriented route of making them all evil communists wanting to destroy Americans. And thanks to the TARDIS translation circuits, you often forget they're Russian at all, so any sense of nationalism goes out of the window and you instead just find yourself invested in a group of people desperately trying to survive an alien menace. They're really well characterised. But I do wish Stepashin had more to do in the episode because he just kind of disappears off screen, and his whole very patriotic, warring status never really plays a role in anything. So we've talked about the historical setting, but let's also talk about the physical setting, which is incredible. Mark Gatiss was fond of movies like Das Boot, so was keen to write a story set on a nuclear submarine. This vehicle is realised so well, especially because the production team brought back Mike Tucker's team from the Russell T Davies era, making this the first story in the 11th Doctor era to use model work. This lends a lot of authenticity to all the outside shots, the practical effects really making things look fantastic. Obviously there is some CGI involved, but the exterior shots are so tangible and real, adding a lot of hopelessness to the events happening inside. The tight corridors and rooms of the nuclear submarine are so oppressive, all the characters crammed together in these tiny spaces with nowhere to move about. It's a constant reminder of how dangerous the mere setting itself is, since all you have standing between you and the extreme crushing pressure of being 700 meters underwater is a metal hull. It's terrifying all on its own, and the confined spaces inject a lot of intensity and claustrophobia, making the narrative feel extremely daunting. Not only are the protagonists trying to survive Skaldak, they're also trying to survive the setting itself. Doctor Who's rich and storied history has introduced a wide array of unique monsters and alien villains to face off against the Doctor across space and time. When the show returned in 2005 and was adapted for the modern TV landscape, most of the iconic monsters were brought back and modernised. The Daleks and the Cybermen had sleeker, more expensive designs. The Sontarans were reimagined to look more serious, and the Silurians were redesigned from the ground up. Even the Makra and the Naimon were updated to an extent, but one monster was conspicuously missing: the Ice Warriors. These ancient Martian warriors had appeared a number of times in Classic Who, facing off against the 2nd and 3rd Doctors. By the time Series 7 rolled around, the Ice Warriors were the most high-profile monster to have not been brought back, and this was actually intentional. Showrunner Stephen Moffat considered them too slow-moving and hard to listen to, fearing they would just invite ridicule. However, frequent collaborator Mark Gatiss was persistent in his wishes to write an Ice Warrior story, so he instead suggested an episode revealing the creature inside the armour. Naturally, Moffat was intrigued by this concept, so Cold War was born. During the submarine's expedition to the North Pole, the crew discovered a mysterious entity encased in ice. It's similar to The Thing, posing the existential question of what kind of monstrous otherworldly entities might be hidden away in the frozen wastes of the world, perfectly preserved and ready to unleash hell. Indeed, when the Doctor and Clara arrive, they're immediately plunged into chaos because Skaldak has thawed out and started wreaking havoc on the submarine, which is now heading towards a watery grave. This is a brilliant way to quite literally throw the Doctor and Clara into the deep end. No chance to get their bearings because they're expected to arrive in Vegas. It's an excellently chaotic scene, and to make things even more intense, the TARDIS just pieces out, leaving the protagonist all alone on this Soviet sub during pretty much the worst time to be two random British people appearing on a Soviet sub without any explanation at all. The Cold War tensions are furthered when Clara regains consciousness in the middle of an argument between the Doctor and Zhukov. This is a great way to introduce the audience to just how extreme the tension between nations was, with the Doctor desperately trying to reason with this man who has been fed constant propaganda telling him all Western people are evil. But before they can iron their differences out, the Doctor comes face to face with his old enemy, the Ice Warriors. I do appreciate how the episode manages to reintroduce them without alienating new viewers. If you're aware of the monsters, it's a good confrontation, reminding you of the power and the history of the race. But if you're completely unaware of them, it gives you a quick crash course of everything there is to know, how they're a Martian military race from thousands of years in our past. It doesn't expect you to know them, which is always the trickiest thing a writer can face when reintroducing a monster from the show's past. And I also like how the Doctor is scared of Skaldak's reputation as the greatest and most revered hero of the Ice Warriors. Considering the previous looks of the monster, it would have been hard to fear him, but this episode manages to do it right from the beginning by having the Doctor fearful of Skaldak, just like he was with the lone Dalek. You know a threat is truly dangerous when even the heroic Doctor is shaking in their boots and ordering Skaldak to be chained up. And yeah, the episode does share a few similarities with Series 1's Dalek, reinventing an old, badly aged monster by shining a spotlight on the danger one captive member poses to the entire planet. Skaldak becoming this unstoppable monster, brutalizing the crew throughout the story, and almost feeling like a full-on slasher villain. He terrorizes the submarine and its crew so effortlessly that you can't help but be scared of him. It's especially threatening because Stepashin immediately electrocutes him, essentially a declaration of war. And Skaldak is pretty much the worst person to ever aggravate.
You will bring down the fires of hell just for laying a glove on him.
He's a war hero. It would be like hitting Aldi Murphy over the head of a beer bottle, sucker punching Richard Bong, flicking a cigarette butt at the Red Baron, or tasering Viltol Pilecki. It's bad enough that you're attacking a highly skilled and decorated warrior, but you're also targeting an icon. Someone so celebrated you'd be ripped to shreds by their nation too. The Doctor would understandably be terrified that this simple act against Skaldak would probably end up causing the entire Ice Warrior race to descend on Earth and wipe it out in seconds for the sheer disrespect against their most decorated hero.
Harm one of us, and you harm us all.
I love the exchange between the Doctor and Zhukov about talking to Skaldak in the attempts of finding a diplomatic solution, with the Doctor laughing off Zhukov's desire to confront the monster because he's a soldier, only to have his own past immediately exposed. No matter what the Doctor does, they'll never be able to shake the reputation of what they did during the Time War, where they fought and killed countless times just like any other soldier. Despite constantly preaching peace and diplomacy, the character will always have that hanging over their head. It's an especially good thing to remind the audience of because of the later reveal of the War Doctor at the end of the series, preparing you for the idea of a warrior incarnation who fought in the Time War and committed all sorts of atrocities. Since neither Zhukov's crew nor the Doctor can go, the responsibility falls to Clara Oswald, who, much like Rose and Dalek, confronts the monster herself. This is a very tense scene, the still new companion having to step right into the lion's den. You really get the sense that she could be killed at any second. The lighting of the scene is incredibly dark and ominous with the flashing red lights, really ramping up the atmosphere as the Doctor tries to reason with Skaldak, who continually rebuffs everything he says. You could cut through the tension like butter, and it's excellently acted by Matt Smith and Nicholas Briggs. A really eerie confrontation that feels so incredibly strange with Clara acting as a proxy, so it works incredibly well. What's even better though is the reveal that Skaldak has long left his suit and escaped into the shadows, ready to enact his revenge. It's hard to imagine the terror Clara must be feeling in this moment. There's only one way in or out of the room, and everything is dark. She has no idea where Skaldak could be, and she knows how vicious he is. So she's absolutely helpless. It's a wonderful payoff to the slow build of intensity, and does a perfect job of introducing the idea of Skaldak out of his suit and on the loose. I'm not sure how I feel about Skaldak being outside of his armour. The suit itself looks really good, an incredible modernisation of an absolutely awful looking original costume. I mean, they literally just looked like Lego minifigures. It was a bit of a disaster. Moffat was absolutely right to be worried about bringing back the Ice Warriors, because they aged horribly after their appearances in the 60s and the 70s. They're almost the exact kind of stereotypical bug-eyed monster people mock the show for including, so it was definitely time for a change. I like how the production team kept the general design intact but made small quality of life improvements, such as adding proper fingers, changing the proportions to remove their very womanly hips, and making the armour look a lot more rugged and impervious. It looks very strong, and reminds me of the impressive redesigns other old school monsters received, legitimising them again by improving their campy, low budget designs they had in Classic Who. Skaldak genuinely fits the title of Ice Warrior, with a much more imposing physique, which is why it's so weird that they take him out of the suit for half the story and have him running around looking like Randall from Monsters Inc. He looks so goofy out of his armour casing, and it kind of nullifies the effect of the titanic, intimidating armour they made for him. It's interesting and cool that an Ice Warrior leaving their suit is established as being the ultimate shame and dishonour, showing how desperate Skaldak has become. But it just seems counterintuitive, like having the lone Dalek do what the Recon Dalek did in Resolution, and spend almost the whole time as a generic squid monster. It strips away the mystery and the intrigue involved with the monster, and it's just not a great idea to incorporate such a drastic change in the monster's reintroduction for a brand new audience unfamiliar with the Ice Warriors in general. It seems better suited for a later story featuring the villains, since this is everyone's first impression. It's too early for big, revolutionary plot points regarding the Ice Warriors. Skaldak's backstory was originally going to be a lot more complex. The early plan was to actually have him as a time traveller from the 31st century, travelling back to the Cold War to provoke nuclear action and wipe out humanity before the human race could dominate Mars in the time he came from. However, I much prefer what we actually get in the episode. Skaldak waking up after 5,000 years to find himself completely alone on an alien world, lost and confused with his alien captors trying to kill him. And all the signals he sends to his people go completely unanswered, so he feels abandoned and wants to destroy the Earth now that he has nothing to lose. It makes things a lot more simple and understandable. It's a straightforward story rather than some convoluted narrative about an alien trying to John Connor his way through the Cold War. Instead, we just get the sense of desperation. It's a nuclear sub teetering on the edge of an underwater cliff, and they have a deadly Martian warrior lurking through the ship like a xenomorph, picking characters off one by one. Everything feels very hopeless for the protagonists. There's nothing they can do, but the consequences of failure would be world-ending. They just have to do whatever it takes to stop Skaldak reaching the nukes. The second half of the story almost feels like a base under siege story. The protagonist trapped inside a location they're trying to protect, whilst the alien threat constantly picks people off. The oppressiveness of the setting itself lends a constant reminder of the danger. It's not even like the characters can just entrench themselves into the bridge and hope for the best, because Skaldak would just come and wipe them out. It's one of those stories where the protagonists just have to survive. There's not really anything the Doctor himself can do to help them. They basically just have to hope for the best. As with a lot of Companions' first trip to the past, it's important to establish the rules of time being in flux. Both Rose and Martha questioned the danger of their alien adversaries, considering the lack of a destroyed world in the modern day. Understandably, we get another scene like that, as Clara states the obvious fact that the world didn't in fact end in nuclear annihilation in the 1980s. I feel like this is an important thing to explain when a new companion is introduced. It's a vital rule for the show's style of time travel, so reintroducing it here is a good way to maintain the higher stakes and keep the threat of nuclear Armageddon looming. I also love the subversive scene as the Professor asks Clara if Ultravox stays together, since she's from the future. It's an excellent twist on the usual "tell me what the future is like" scene. We expect him to try and force her to tell him the outcome of the war, just like Rose told Nancy about the Allies winning World War II, but instead he just wants to know about his favourite band. It's such a simple and endearing joke that comes completely out of the blue, once again helping to humanise the supporting cast and make them sympathetic characters you don't want to see die. The scene also sees Clara realising just how dangerous life with the Doctor can be. I feel like every companion has this culture shock moment, that dreaded realization of not everything being fun and games. You're risking your life every time you step into the TARDIS, and the Doctor can't always be there to help you out. Clara was able to float by in her first 2 adventures without feeling too much risk. She felt safe, but this is a completely different situation. She's trapped so far away with the Doctor out of his depth, and a brutal monster slowly dismembering and dismantling the people around them. We never get to see it, but it's implied that the bodies of Skaldak's victims are gory and horrific. He has carefully picked them apart like experiments, and it's understandable that Clara would be shocked by such a sight, because it's that moment of crashing down to earth and realizing just what's at stake. This crisis of confidence and fear of the same fate befalling her too.
It's all got very real.
Having discovered all he needs to know about the nukes, Skaldak summons his armour, once again becoming a very upfront and intimidating threat. He's just this absolute tank, bullets easily bouncing off of him like they're nothing. It's a shame they didn't have him like this for the entire story. Instead, they wasted time with him skulking in the shadows, and I think that takes away from the narrative. However, I do love the final confrontation. The Doctor desperately trying to reason with the Ice Warrior and questioning where the honour is in condemning an entire planet to die based on the actions of a few. After all, the Doctor would know because of how he ended the Time War. Indeed, the Doctor once again falls back to the final option, mutually assured destruction. This deterrent was a central aspect of the Cold War conflict, and it gets mentioned a number of times throughout this episode. Mutually assured destruction essentially means both sides dying because they have the same weapons as each other, so nobody would win the conflict. If the USA launched a nuke at the Soviets would fire one right back, ensuring complete destruction for both. It's pretty much the main reason the Cold War never escalated to a nuclear conflict, since both nations knew they would be condemning their own people if they acted. So having that as the climax of the episode is perfectly thematic. This idea of the Doctor threatening to blow the sub and himself up before Skaldak can launch the nukes, therefore taking them both out rather than allowing the planet to be destroyed. It's kind of like the entire Cold War in a nutshell, showing how the episode is almost an allegory for the war itself, explaining all the core concepts and dangers by turning it into a snazzy Doctor Who plot instead of a lecture. Therefore the title Cold War is completely on point, since obviously it has the meaning of the coldness of the Ice Warrior, but it also has a lot of layers and deeper meanings you notice when you're familiar with the conflict.
Which of us shall blink first?
And much like the actual Cold War itself, there is no real capitulation from either side, since the Ice Warriors return in the nick of time to retrieve Skaldak. It feels like a really relieving moment as he chooses mercy, not pushing the button after all. I don't think this would have happened without Clara. She brought that personal touch, since Skaldak had earlier told her all about his daughter, with Clara now bringing up those warm, bittersweet memories as a reason for Skaldak to be merciful and think of the innocents. It shows what the companion brings to the table. Much like the Rings of Akaton before it, the Doctor has the right idea but the wrong execution, with Clara stepping in to seal the deal and doing it right. The Doctor was trying to appeal to Skaldak the warrior with nothing to lose, but Clara appeals to Skaldak the father with a daughter he cares about. It's the kind of way the Doctor-companion dynamic should be. The companion filling in the morality of the Doctor and serving as another viewpoint. Someone with more compassion and, well, humanity. It's thanks to Clara that the Doctor saves the world, and I think she sums it up perfectly with this single line.
That's what we do.
It's a team effort. On their own they'd fail, but together they work perfectly, the ideal unit, which is something that would go on to become a core component of their relationship throughout Clara's time on the show, culminating in the Hybris storyline, deconstructing their increasingly toxic relationship as they overestimate their abilities and threaten to destroy time and space itself for each other. So it's nice to see the seeds of that being sown as early on as this. Although, rather awkwardly, the TARDIS has pieced out to the South Pole, which is the other side of the planet. This submarine is a Delta II class sub, which reaches a speed of 14 miles per hour surfaced and 28 miles per hour submerged. I took to Twitter to see how long it would take to get back to the TARDIS, and the answer was 443 hours, which is about 2 weeks as the crow flies. So I guess the Doctor and Clara better get comfy. Cold War is an okay episode of Doctor Who. It's neither awful nor is it a masterpiece. Instead, it's just kind of there, like most Mark Gatiss episodes. There are a lot of very good aspects to it, like the atmosphere and the oppressive claustrophobic setting. It feels very intense and cramped, adding a constant feeling of pressure and anxiety. I love the parallels to the titular conflict, how the storyline almost Doctor Whoifies the entire war, telling it through the lens of this alien monster trying to trigger mutually assured destruction. Skaldak feels like an excellent threat, constantly outmaneuvering his adversaries, and the updated Ice Warrior design is a significant improvement upon the original look. But I just don't like how they immediately take him out of his suit for the bulk of the story. Whilst it does give him this stalkerish, shadowy presence, it just doesn't feel like the right decision for the first Ice Warrior story since the 1970s. Therefore, I would give Cold War a C grade on the Series 7B tier list. It handles its subject material really well and the performances are great, lending a really sympathetic look at the often villainised Soviet Union, whose people were just as scared of the conflict as the West. The characters are all written well, but there's just something lackluster about the episode. The pacing feels a bit stop-start and bumpy with a lot of exposition, so if you're fascinated by the Cold War like Mark Gatiss is, it's definitely a worthwhile watch, but it might be a little bit too boring or self-indulgent for anyone who doesn't care for a history lesson no matter how well it's communicated. Compared to the 3 stellar episodes before it, Cold War just feels like a missed opportunity, and a bit of a typically forgettable Gatiss episode, not one you'd want to revisit much after you've watched it for the very first time. But the same definitely cannot be said for the next episode. Oh boy. And I'd like to give an extra special thank you to my Asbantium level patron, Fallon Cortez, my Diamond level patron, Valtar, my Platinum level patron, Maximilian Foreman, and all my Gold level patrons, Calvin, Daniel Shillito, Franz Horn aka Line Vortex, Golg Nogler, Herna Versog, and Luke_SY. Thank you so much for your support.